Marxism teaches us that in the capitalist mode of production, it is workers who produce commodities, and that is the beating heart of the system. But social reproduction theory asks the question that if workers produce commodities, who produces the worker? So social reproduction theory is really about the social processes that produce labor power as a commodity, and how those social processes of the production of labor power is connected to and imbricated with the social processes that produce the commodity. So if we say, let's say that the worker goes into her workplace at 7 in the morning and leaves her workplace at 5 p.m. in the afternoon, then social reproduction theory is the narrative of what happens before 7 a.m. and what happens after 5 p.m. So to go back to the question of who produces the worker, the first answer to this is fairly obvious, that it is because the worker had a bed to sleep in and a house where she had the bed and food to eat, that her labor power was regenerated enough for her to go back to work at 7 a.m. in the morning. Similarly, after 5 p.m., she came home and that process starts again. She also perhaps has support from friends or family who provide psychical support to her because she's had a rough day at work perhaps, for her to be able to go back the next morning. So that is about social reproduction taking place within the private sphere, within the ambit of the family. So that part of the answer is fairly straightforward. The other subsection to the answer of who produces the worker is social reproduction theory tells us that there is a direct biological reproduction of the working class, which happens within the family through childbirth. That is one of the key ways in which the working class is reproduced. But of course, reproduction of the working class within the family is not the only way that the working class is reproduced within a social context. Immigration and slavery are two of the main ways in which people are forced into a nationally bounded site as the workforce. Before social reproduction theory sort of emerged, many feminists did acknowledge and did some wonderful creative work around privatized social reproduction. So domestic labor, etc., the work within the family, were all really theorized and approached quite creatively before social reproduction theory. And many feminists actually think that the writ of social reproduction ends there within the family. So it's the family that needs to be theorized. But other social reproduction theorists, and I count myself amongst them, and that's what the book also tries to address, is we see the writ of social reproduction theory much wider than the family. So for instance, how is the working class reproduced is not just about the work that's done within the family, but what kind of access does this community have to water? Think about Flint, Michigan, or Detroit, where access to water was so violently affected by the class and race dimensions of that part of the country. What kind of public parks do the working class children have access to? What kind of healthcare system exists in this country that the working class can access? So those public functions, those public socialized services, we argue in the book, are also crucial parts of the reproduction of the social reproduction of the working class. And this is where I think the book is very clear and kind of tries to think through these various social relations, the capitalist social relations that actually reproduce the working class. And the real lesson, I think, for us to have written this book and worked on this book, and I hope the real lesson for the next generation of thinkers and activists who approach social reproduction theory, is that we understood that capitalism needs a stable set of social relations to reproduce itself. Okay? There has to be certain kinds of work discipline, there has to be certain kinds of political formations that allow capitalism to do this. Social reproduction theory taught us that at every moment that those social relations are forged by capitalism are also moments for potential interruption of those social relations. So every battle for housing, every battle for free access to healthcare, every battle for water, clean water, can also take the shape of, and certainly has the potential and the seed for, a wider anti-systemic struggle. And that's the real lesson that I think we drew from social reproduction theory, and that we hope people will develop upon, both in their scholarship, but also on the streets.
The images of the water are shocking enough.
Would you drink that? People have dumped in this river forever. It's like we're in a cesspool.
My tub, you should see it, it's brown.
And then come the headlines. An American city failed to provide basic protections to its citizens, and now the children of Flint have much higher than normal levels of lead in their blood. Rick Snyder, governor of Michigan, has apologized.
I am sorry, and I will fix it.
President Obama declared a national emergency.
You can't shortchange basic services that we provide to our people.
And now 2016 presidential candidates are starting to weigh in.
The governor of that state acted as though he didn't really care.
Lead poisoning is terrible and terrifying. No amount of exposure is safe. And there's evidence that years after we got it out of paint, gas, and more, it contributed to a drastic drop in crime in the 90s. The city has switched back to cleaner water, but the effects will last decades. We take clean water for granted. How could this possibly happen in 2016? Well, you've got to rewind to 2011. Flint was broke. It had lost about half its population after the car factories closed. It had $1.1 billion in unfunded pension costs. It had to cut half its police force. Michigan had a solution called emergency managers.
Now he's been appointed by the governor to turn around Flint's finances. Mike, welcome.
These managers can make cost-cutting measures without the normal political procedure.
I think what we have to do is look at the expense side first. There could be services that we can no longer provide in the city.
And they decided the city could save money on water. Flint would stop buying water from Detroit and join a new regional water system. And as a temporary measure, Flint would use water from the Flint River. The switch happened in 2014.
Here's the Flint.
And who decided to do this exactly is under intense debate. But regardless of blame, the story gets worse. Residents saw and tasted the dirty water and started complaining.
Water's brown, has a bad odor. I'm afraid to even
feed it to my cat or my dogs.
We should not have to pay for the water. It's nasty.
But the city claimed federal tests showed the water was safe. An employee at the Environmental Protection Agency leaked a Michigan report to a local activist, which showed the water had higher than normal lead levels. The city's response? Flint told the woman the lead came from her plumbing. It took an outside investigation by Virginia Tech researchers that found elevated lead levels in the water for the state to admit there was a problem in September 2015.
So the corrosion's eating up the pipes, it's eating up the iron pipes, it's causing main breaks, it's causing discolored water, and about 20% of the homes there's just too much lead.
In October 2015, the government bought water filters for its citizens and switched back to water from Detroit. Before all this, 2.1% of the city's children had high blood lead levels. After, it was 4%. For kids under 5 in the most affected zip codes, it was 6.3%. Why did Flint poison its citizenry? Under emergency managers from the state, it wanted to save money. To start to reverse the effects will cost dearly. Just switching back to Detroit's water cost $12 million. A class action lawsuit against the city is pending.